The Rest is Politics is efficiently powered by Fuse Energy.
If you've got an electric vehicle, or if you're thinking about it, Fuse has a smart tariff with overnight charging for only 5p a kilowatt hour.
And that's now available on both Apple and Android app stores and works with a wide range of chargers. No faff, no filibustering, no unexpected U-turns.
So quite unlike politics, and you don't even need a PhD in engineering. You just plug in your EV before bed and it'll be ready before the headlines hit your inbox.
So if you need a charger installed, Fuse will sort the hardware, the fitting and the setup, often in under a week.
And when you sign up, you'll get the Trip Plus members deal completely free. Ad-free listening, early access to Question Time, bonus episodes, and pre-sale tickets to our live shows.
So while your car recharges, your podcast feed gets a power boost too.
Just head to getfuse.com/politics, download the app, and use the code POLITICS.
Smart tariff, swift installation, no white papers, green papers, or red tape required.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell. And Rory, you've insisted that we start with this question. I assume it's because you're brimming with ideas. Adam Hensel, as professional armchair critics, I might rebut that actually.
Well, we do have arms on our chair.
We do have arms, but are we armchair critics? Anyway, offer us some potential solutions to the UK migration issue. At least Adam doesn't call it a crisis, he calls it an issue.
Like, that's going to be unfair, but let's imagine that I was stereotyping you. I would say you're somebody who is very comfortable with multicultural Britain, probably feels the anxieties about immigration are overdone, certainly has said on the podcast in the past that talking about it too much hands stuff to Nigel Farage, and that you don't really want to be associated with Rwanda-style politics, stop the boat, stop immigration. In fact, you used to wear a T-shirt saying something like "Open minds, open borders," didn't you?
That was the slogan of the New European, now the New World.
Yeah.
I also wear a T-shirt sometimes that says "Refugees welcome." Look, I honestly do think the first thing we have to do is to change the tone and the nature of the debate. Because the reason why we have an issue and why we do get a lot of questions about this and why it is so salient in our politics is that I think a lot of the fears may be genuine, okay, but I think a lot of the facts, in quotes, around which the debate is based are not. And so, for example, you mentioned there, stop the boats. I completely agree with the importance of, quotes, stopping the boats.
You do agree with that?
Totally. And by the way, this is what so riles me up about Farage. The situation has got a lot worse since Brexit. The numbers have got a lot worse since Brexit because the systems that we depended on have eroded. So I'm all in favour of them trying to stop the boats, not least because it stops people dying needlessly.
So you're not on the side of the argument that these are incredibly vulnerable, needy people who are just trying to get a better life and fleeing persecution, getting on rubber boats, and therefore we should welcome them.
What I'm against is them being in the position where they've either, I'm in favour of, quote, smash the gangs, because it's become a big thing for organised crime. But I'll give you one idea, which I think might be worth thinking about. So, as I understand it, you can no longer just turn up at a British embassy anywhere in the world and say, I'm fleeing persecution.
Which was true. When I was in the embassy in Indonesia, we had somebody who hopped over the wall. In fact, we built these big walls to try to stop it happening. But when they hopped over the wall, they were taking refuge in our embassy, a bit like Assange.
So let's just say you went, but now I know the numbers are large, okay? And we don't have big embassies in a lot of the countries from which these people are fleeing. But if you were able to have your case assessed at a local level by a local diplomat.
Let me say I like that idea. Not quite that idea, to lean into my slight disagreement, agreeable disagreement. I think we've taken another level. It's actually the idea that David Cameron started to pioneer, and Theresa May did a lot on, which is that you rely on UNHCR, the UN agency, to screen genuine cases in country. We did it first in Lebanon and Jordan on the borders of Syria with refugees, did it in Pakistan with Afghan refugees. The idea is that you give a quota to UNHCR. So let's say Britain's going to take 25,000 asylum seekers a year, but they're going to be processed outside the United Kingdom, and then they're brought in. But what's the problem? The problem is that actually the tradition of international law...
Hold on, the question from Adam is solutions, Rory.
Yeah. Okay.
So don't give us the problems.
Yeah.
You want solutions.
Okay. Or
I've given you a small solution.
Yeah.
A small part of a solution.
Yeah. Which is the processing in third countries.
Yeah. And by the way, you could take that into a third-party organisation. And that's why, for example, I know you're in favour of the whole Rwanda thing. Now, I thought the Rwanda thing in the last government was a complete gimmick and a total waste of money. And I recently met somebody who works for the Rwandan government who literally said the words, "We so saw them coming." So we wasted a lot of time, a lot of effort. But I'm not against some sort of processing and some sort of assessment taking place in different countries.
Okay, so as usual, with disagreeable agreement, that's not quite my position. I absolutely think that Rwanda was the wrong choice, done in the wrong way, incredibly expensive, and was never going to work. But the principle behind it, which is that you look for safe third countries and you say that anyone arriving on your shores, they're coming after all from a safe country, right? They're coming from France, which is safe to Britain. You can say, look, we don't have a responsibility to put you up in Britain. What we have a responsibility to is to make sure that you're safe. And the EU did a deal exactly like this with Turkey, and it had an incredible impact. They did it in the midst of the migrant crisis. The EU-Turkey deal involved the European Union providing a lot of support for Turkey, and Turkey, in response, agreeing that they would keep people in Turkey rather than facilitating them getting on boats to Greece. It cut the numbers down in a couple of months from tens of thousands down to a few hundred. And it only broke apart because the EU-Turkey relationship broke apart. So actually, the answer to this in Britain and across Europe is partly about agreements with Turkey, North Africa, and other safe third countries to take asylum seekers.
Don't you think the whole problem of this entire debate is that it's happening at a time when nationalism is, in a lot of our politics, more powerful than internationalism? So I would argue this thing, a bit like climate, a bit like some of the environmental challenges, is not going to be solved country by country. This is where I think we're in agreement, but I think it's how you then do it. So you've talked before about maybe every country agreeing to take a number of what
Let me explain that quickly. So this is my idea that you set up. Actually, it's an idea that I developed with my friend Gerald Knaus, that you develop a global refugee coalition where every country agrees to take 0.05% of its population annually, right? So there's maybe 5 families for a town of 10,000 people on average spread across the country every year.
But are you talking there about asylum seekers?
Asylum seekers.
Right. So not the economic immigration.
No, asylum
we're going to need more of that as well.
Exactly. So asylum seekers only we're talking about here. And let's say the UK would take 40,000 every year. So over 10 years, there's 400,000 people, a lot of people. But at the same time, Canada's taking 20,000, the United States taking 120,000. Of course, easier before Trump.
Is one person a person or is it a family?
One person's a person. And the idea here is that if the whole world shares the burden and sets up good criteria, and you're targeting not, and this is another thing that's going to annoy some people listening to this, I'm afraid it is true that a lot of the people crossing those boats are young men who were not necessarily in lethal danger of their lives. The problems they were in might have been bad, but it's nothing like what a female judge faced under the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? So you want to target the female judges from Afghanistan, not a 16-year-old kid who's come over from Kurdistan, who's paid a lot of money to a people smuggler and who's hoping to bring their family over after them, because that's just nonsense, right? I'm not saying that those people are not great in many ways. I'm not buying into this idea, which the far right's trying to sell, which is that they have made London unrecognizable and unsafe and that they're all creating criminal gangs. That isn't true at all. My experience with an enormous number of young Afghans that I meet in London is that they're working incredibly hard, they're doing well in school, they're doing well in businesses, they're making a real contribution. But we do not have a moral obligation to take people from France. They're not persecuted and risk their lives.
So hold on, so just on the France thing, so sort the boats problem out.
And the only way of sorting the boats problem out is if the French government want to sort it out. And the only way in which the French government will want to sort it out is if the government's brave and returns to what Yvette Cooper was talking about and then dropped, which is we'll say to France, okay, we will take our share of your genuine asylum seekers, and in return, any single person who lands on British shores, we're pushing back to France.
The other thing that Yvette Cooper could do, and I don't know whether this is on the agenda at all, but actually is to revisit the idea of identity cards.
Of course we should have identity cards, yeah. Now, that's going to involve a big, big fight, unfortunately, with actually international law and UNHCR, because UNHCR inherited a system set up after the Second World War where people were horrified by the fact that Jews crossing from Germany into Switzerland were pushed back by the Swiss into Germany and then killed. So the system basically is set up to say, if you can land in someone else's country, you claim asylum there, right?
Yeah.
And UNHCR has a lot of people in it who talk as though they believe in open borders. And when I'm teasing you about your T-shirt, I think that's part of the problem. People shouldn't be wearing T-shirts saying open borders. You obviously don't believe in open borders, and it's a real gift to...
You sure you said open borders?
Yeah, it said open minds, open borders.
Did it?
Yeah.
Mm.
So the second thing, though, that we need to talk about is legal migration, because it would be a big mistake for any government today, anywhere in Europe or the West, to go into an election thinking that it's enough just to have an answer to illegal migrants or asylum seekers if you don't have an answer to the much bigger numbers, which is coming to Britain in a single year, 750,000 people coming in, hundreds of thousands of them on student visas, hundreds of thousands on family visas, and a few 100,000 coming into work.
But the reason why I talk about the way the debate is conducted, so I don't have the data in front of me, but the numbers involved in the small boats,
Tiny.
Tens
of thousands.
What you're talking about.
Yeah.
You mentioned there the universities. One of the outcomes, I fear, of the spending review is that a lot of universities are going to really, really struggle. One of the reasons, now we could argue, well, you got into the mess because of fees and then you need to get more money from overseas students, etc. But the debate about immigration means that I think at a time when our top universities should be doing everything to get the brightest and the best from around the world to come and study here, we're putting up barriers instead.
Okay, but now let me again disagree. I think we're confusing two different things. There was, I think, quite a smart policy which was put in place by Rishi Sunak to say the very top students in the world should be fast-tracked. So it's very easy to get a visa to come to the United Kingdom, or was under him if you'd been at Harvard, whatever. Right? That isn't quite the same as what I see, unfortunately, when I go often to graduation ceremonies for some British universities that are not on the top tier. Often they are actually universities that have been really struggling in terms of student numbers, financial viability, and are bringing in a very, very large number of not particularly top-notch students.
From China?
No. I mean, an enormous number. The last graduation I went to had actually come from Nigeria. And as far as I could tell, they actually only did a few weeks of study in the United Kingdom. They were an incredibly important revenue stream. They got to go back and say that they had a degree from this university. I was not certain that they were top flight students. I was not certain they were making a huge contribution to the British economy. And I was a bit worried that actually what we've got here is a system where we're not funding our universities properly. So we're forcing them to bring in people who may not actually be making a huge contribution.
But I've said a few weeks ago, and we said yesterday on the main episode that, we thought there wasn't this sort of national story. Part of the national story for Britain, I think, is that this is a place to welcome the brightest and the best brains around the world. And at a time, for example, when Donald Trump is whacking the intellectual elite and the arts and humanities and top universities and undermining their reputation, we should be trying to get those people to come here.
But how do we do it? And Labour's not really helping itself. One way in which you'd help it is if you produce tax breaks for them.
Yeah.
So traditionally, the way in which people did it is they got a lot of foreign capital into the country, a lot of investment into the country by providing tax breaks for non-doms. That's been taken away. I mean, the question, if you are a very talented person who's very business-oriented and really wants to make money, does the UK strike you as a place where you're going to want to come in and invest, where you're going to be able to make money, which is going to be low tax, competitive, good capital markets, innovative? Probably not. The reality is at the moment that all the signals coming from the Labour government don't really feel as though Britain is welcoming in money.
Well, but I think you're confusing their wealth with talent. I'm not talking about getting people in because they've got loads of money. I'm talking about people getting in because they've got really good brains.
But the two things are connected.
Well,
so if you're a really ambitious software engineer, and you could be coming from Kenya, you could be coming from China, you could be coming from India, you're coming in to live the dream of creating your amazing tech startup in AI or quantum, and your models are the great heroes of Silicon Valley. You go to Silicon Valley in the US, There's incredible amount of venture funds that will put money into your startup business. There's a culture that celebrates hard work. There's an incredible ecosystem of other people working in software. Come to the United Kingdom. You could be just a very bright Estonian coder. You set up your fintech business. Pretty soon you're moving to relist in the United States. And part of the problem is that there's a connection between being the great innovator in the most productive part of the economy, which is tech, and then what happens in terms of your taxes and money at the end of it.
My final point on this, it actually restates what I said earlier about the tone and nature of the debate. While the debate is dominated by this sense of nationalism, screaming front pages day after day in the Express and the Mail and the Sun, BBC tending to follow that agenda on the debate, government tending to follow that side of the debate rather than sort of stand up for why we need, in a vibrant, dynamic, modern economy, we need to keep our eye on the people that we need to come in and we need to go out and get the best. Until we change that frame, I don't think we're going to crack this problem. So although Adam calls it being an armchair critic, what I think I'm trying to do is to say to people that we have got ourselves into a place where we seem to define anyone who is not of us, not British, coming into this country is somehow a burden. We're not going to be able to run hospitals and care homes and schools and prisons and all the other public services unless we understand we've got to go and get people from outside.
100%. But if you look at the numbers of the hundreds of thousands who are coming in, only a couple of 100,000 of them are coming in to do those jobs.
Yeah. So
the majority are coming on very different types of visas. Yeah. As I say, student visas, which are not often for great universities, family reunification visas, and the talent bit, really getting that talent bit right.
It's about more than immigration. It's about much more than immigration. That is where the national story comes in. Anyway, I don't know if we disagreed or agreed there in the end, but thank you, Adam, for calling us armchair critics. Yeah. How dare you?
Now, here is a question. Hannah Collins asked whether I'm as outraged as I'm sure Alastair is by the BBC's obsessive coverage of reform. It completely outweighs coverage of any other party. Please talk to us about the knock-on effect of this. Well, first, Alastair, over to you. Tell us about BBC's coverage of reform and what you actually thought about it and why you were cross.
I don't know whether it's cross. I just think that they've got 5 MPs?
Yeah, this is something you've teased me about in the past, which is that, to be honest, I'd struggle often to name the chairman of any of the political parties, including Labour and Conservative. But the one chairman of a political party I really can name is Zia Yousef.
Labour Ellie Reeves, Conservative Nigel Huddleston.
Good man, Nigel Huddleston.
Greens John Knott.
Yeah.
Lib Dems Baroness Caroline Pidgeon. Now, why can you name Zia Yousef? Because I know that the BBC and all the other media outlets, they have to compete. They have to try and get our attention. But honestly, to get a breaking news alert, Zia Yousef has resigned as chairman of Reform. And then Chris Mason writing this essay like it was the biggest thing in the world. Why this matters, why you should think this matters. And then 2 days later, Zia Yousef unresigns. And it leads the news at a time when Gaza is kicking off, LA is kicking off, it leads the news. And the reason
it was a great story, though. It's a bit like Trump-Musk, wasn't it?
No, fuck.
It was kind of weird, wasn't it? Zia Yousef comes,
Seriously?
attacks Raj, and then suddenly he's back again. What's he doing going back again? I mean, it's like fascinating, isn't it?
Well, hold on.
Yeah.
And I did actually have some polite but spirited exchanges with Nick Robinson at the BBC Today programme, because they did Zia Yousef at the start of the week as the main, and as you know from your politics day, 8:10
is the big interview.
That's where the BBC says this is the most important thing happening in the world today.
I remember. I think I only got about 4 of those interviews, and it was a big deal in my political career.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So 8:10 has sort of got this mythical status. And there's Nick Robinson. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't get listened to, and because, people are thinking, well, who is this guy? Because he's just been leading the news for the last 3 days.
Not who is this guy. We all know who he is. He's the chairman of Reform.
So the questions were all about, so why did you leave? And he sort of said, well, I felt a bit tired. I found it very exhausting. I hadn't had a holiday, and this was not. And then Nick Robinson.
And clearly that wasn't the reason he left, right? He must have left with a massive falling out with Farage.
Part of the reason he left was because the new MP had this thing. He stood up at Prime Minister's questions and said, would Keir Starmer agree with me that we should ban the burqa? And Keir Starmer said no, and then Zia Yousef put out a statement saying that it was a really dumb question because that's not even our party policy, which suggested things were already fraying.
Zia Yousef is a Muslim who's trying to...
Yeah, but Rory, wait a minute. He may be a Muslim.
Yeah.
They've got 5 MPs. One of them Rupert Lowe's already legged it. Okay. They've got the woman who came in at the by-election.
We've all heard of him too. I mean, Rupert Lowe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've all heard of Sarah Potcher. We've all heard of Lee Anderson.
Yeah, Lee Anderson.
The only one we forget from time to time is the guy who beats women up, right? So my point is the Lib Dems, and Nick Robinson, to be fair, he said in his response to me, where I think you've got a point is we don't maybe give space to the Lib Dems and the Greens, right? But you can do that. Right. So I just think that this is, and I heard, right, somebody how can I say this without dropping a friend in it? Somebody very, 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 very senior in the BBC management structure. Very, 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 very
Not dropping
senior.
them in it, yeah.
You could almost say right at the top
Almost, yeah.
of the organisation.
Almost say that,
goes
yeah.
around saying to people that the BBC has to get in touch with this angry zeitgeist and this populist anger, and we've got to shed our woke image. The woke image of the BBC has been created by the people they're pandering to. The Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Sun, and now Reform.
Where Nick Robinson's got a point is that it would be completely mad for the BBC to ignore the rise of Reform. I think there is a decent chance now that something that hasn't happened in 100 years will happen in British politics, which is that Reform will replace the Conservatives as the major party. I think populism is the big story of our decade, from Trump to Millet to Maloney onwards.
I think the media is, the question is whether they're covering it or driving it. And I fear at the moment that, look, it's my old point I make all the time. Too many people within the broadcasting organisations, not just the BBC, but the BBC is more important than the others, that's the fact. Too many of them, they decide their agenda for the day by taking in the papers to their morning meetings and sitting around saying, oh, well, the Mail have splashed on it, we've got to cover it. Oh, the Times have led on this today. Oh, the Telegraph's got this piece by Robert Jenrick talking about his latest sort of stunt. We've got to cover it. Whereas actually, I think their job is to stand back and say what is actually happening. Now, the other point Nick made to me, and is a fair point, he said, look, if Keir Starmer's making a speech saying reform is now the threat.
Yeah, that's a very good point, right?
That is a fair point.
So the Prime Minister himself is saying reform is the big story. Yeah.
That is a fair point.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean to me that you then say, when some guy that most of your viewers and listeners have literally never heard of.
No, we all heard of him. Zia Yousef. That's the point. You just
most
proved
of
that.
the viewers and listeners had not heard of him until the BBC actually started to think this guy's a story. Now, I'm trying to be fair and reasonable here.
What?
Yeah. So when I had a long chat with Farage in the green room in wherever it was where we did question time, he actually, I remember it's the first time I really clocked onto this. He said, "Oh, we've got this guy, Zia Yousef, he's shit hot."
In the absolute palace of truth, Alastair, was there not a microsecond of a moment after Zia Yousef's resignation where you thought, let's get him on the rest of this politics leading and interview him?
I'd still like to do that. I would still like to do that because we're a different sort of medium. I'm talking about the news medium, okay? So I think that it's fair. They're a story. They're doing well in the polls. But let's talk about the Scottish by-election.
Tell us about the Scottish by-election.
Okay, so the Scottish by-election up in Hamilton last week, okay? So the whole build-up was part of this, as you say, the rise and rise of reform. Now, it is newsworthy. I accept that Reform did better in that by-election than they normally do in Scotland.
And the Conservatives basically completely disappeared.
Correct.
It was unbelievable, right?
Correct. That's part of the story. On the morning, let me tell you this, Rory. This will interest you. Let me just get you the betting odds on the day. So, Rory, the by-election in Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse.
Yes.
Now, normally, a Scottish Parliament election would not be that big a story across the entire news.
No, correct. We barely know what's going on.
The reason why there was such a build-up to it, and why when the day it happened, it was live coverage, was because they thought Reform might win.
And is that because Farage was selling that story to them?
No, Farage actually was saying if we won this, it would be an absolute miracle.
He was trying to downplay. He was doing the famous Ken Baker Westminster strategy.
He knew that he was doing quite well, so he was trying to downplay. Let me tell you what the odds at the bookmakers were the day before the by-election.
Yeah, these bookies, they're always right,
SNP 20 to 1 on.
So if you bet £20, you'd make £1.
Correct.
Oh, that's rubbish.
Exactly. Yeah. So in other words, we, the bookies, think it's all over. The SNP have won. Reform, 9 to 1, second favourite. Good bet.
Okay.
Labour, 12-1.
So if you bet pounds, you get £12.
And why were the bookies saying that? Because the media was building up the story that Reform might win this. And that's a better story.
Well, wait a sec. The bookies were saying SNP were going to win.
The bookies were saying the SNP because they couldn't believe that Reform could do it.
Okay.
Nobody saw Labour coming. If they're the odds, and that's the conventional wisdom, why is the story not Labour have done rather well here?
Yeah.
Taking a seat from
That's
the
the
SNP.
story you'd do, wouldn't it?
What was the BBC headline? Is Reform the real winner?
When the story should have been miraculous Labour victory.
I don't care what the headlines are, Rory, but I don't care about headlines. I care about deep arguments. But I just think it was a very interesting example of where the whole thing was framed within this context of the rise of Reform. Now, it was a good result for Reform.
Yeah.
To get 7,000 in a Scottish by-election was a good result.
And a terrible result for the Tories. What did they get at the end?
Unbelievable. Wiped out.
Yeah.
So that's the story.
Yeah.
Don't make the story about Reform. Could Nigel Farage be the next Prime Minister? The story is Reform destroying the Conservative Party, who got tanked at the last election?
Let's take a break and we'll come back for more questions. You wanted to ask about the story around Greta Thunberg and the flotilla going to Gaza. We had some very interesting questions around cybersecurity, cyber attacks, and I wanted to talk about AI.
Hello, I'm Gordon Carrera, national security journalist.
And I'm David McCloskey, CIA analyst turned spy novelist.
Together, we're the co-hosts of another goal hanger show called The Rest is Classified, where we bring you the best stories from the world of secrets and spies.
We have just released a series on the decades-long battle between the CIA and Osama bin Laden, and this week we are stepping into the devastation of the 9/11 terror attacks to understand how Osama bin Laden was able to carry out such a plot right under the nose of the CIA.
It was a moment that changed global politics forever, shifting the focus of spy agencies away from nation states towards hunting for terrorists and understanding the extremist ideology that drove them.
We will then go into the decade-long manhunt for Osama bin Laden, which culminated in a dramatic raid at his compound in Pakistan in 2011, which killed the world's most wanted terrorist.
So if all of this sounds good, we've got a clip waiting for you at the end of the episode.
Welcome back to The Rest of Politics, Question Time with me, Rory Stewart.
And with me, Alastair Campbell.
And slight irony alert, which is that, of course, having said that we should have been concentrating on what was happening in Gaza, and the BBC kept talking about Reform, we've just spent the last 15 minutes talking about Reform. So let's get on to what you said we should have been talking about. Brian Gorch, surely you have to agree the picture of Greta Thunberg smiling sheepishly as the IDF offers her a sandwich exposes the hollowness of lefty activism. What was the real point of this stunt? Who did it help? And similar question from Charlotte Lees and Madeline. What do you think of Greta being captured? So what did you make of that moment? And just explain, as far as I remember, this story of flotillas goes back a long way. 2010, when I was newly elected as an MP, one of the first big issues that, in fact, it was the first issue, I think, that David Cameron answered in his very first Prime Minister's questions, was about the fact that the Israelis had boarded a flotilla on its way to Gaza from Turkey. 9 people had been killed because the Israelis had rappelled onto the ship, and then they'd shot people who they said had been threatening them. And it was one of those moments, 2010, where David Cameron said, as a friend of Israel, and I've always called myself a friend of Israel, and then the but comes, right? There was another flotilla that was coming to pick up Greta Thunberg, I think from Cyprus or Malta, which mysteriously exploded or had some malfunction on its way. This one she boarded. She boarded with a member of the European Parliament. They were carrying nappies, baby milk, food, small amounts, to relieve the Gaza blockade. Definitely not carrying weapons. I mean, genuinely was carrying humanitarian supplies into Gaza. And Katz, the Israeli security minister, authorized the arrest and the stopping of the boat, calling Greta Thunberg a pro-Hamas anti-Semite and saying Israel would not accept this form of interference. Anyway, what do you make of it all?
And they're being deported.
Deported.
Well, look, I am unashamed fan of Greta Thunberg, and I know that's a very unusual position for a middle-aged, aging white man.
Who writes books about how young people can change the world.
Correct. And actually who in that book, But What Can I Do, had a profile of Greta Thunberg as a very good example of somebody who decided as a teenager, I am going to make a difference. And I think she's made a massive difference in the environmental debate, albeit that it's going backwards.
Yeah.
But I think she's a big part of that still.
Is she not, and I don't know how old she is now, but
Early 20s?
Is it not quite a sort of, in a sense, a slightly tragic story that she was an icon of a moment where we really thought that people like she were the future, and now she feels oddly kind of outdated, like a kind of boy band that faded?
No, I'm not sure about that, because it was interesting to me at the swimming this morning, a couple of the kind of my generation, bit younger, saying that their kids had raised her. One in the context of, why has nobody been talking about this flotilla until the Israelis arrested her? But also, I think you underestimate how she still does have a very powerful in with a lot of people around the world. I mean, and certainly for somebody of her age and her background, it's pretty extraordinary. And I think that there is something really weird when you get Piers Morgan, for example, showing this shows that she's a sort of, entitled, self-obsessed narcissist. I mean, look in the mirror, mate. Why does she wind them up so much?
It's interesting, isn't it?
She's an activist. She's trying to make the thing about Gaza, Rory, is why are the Israelis, we talked about this last week, why have the Israelis been so adamant that journalists can't go into Gaza? Because they understand that in war, the battle of the narrative is hugely important. I think the reason why they were so angry with her in this boat is that just for a day or two, she sort of punctured the narrative.
And the purpose of it was to say, here we are, obviously not bringing weapons, bringing humanitarian assistance.
And they don't want it.
Why can't we bring it in?
And the reason they don't want it is because they actually don't want to give this stuff to the people of Gaza. They've got this humanitarian fund going, and they're pretending that this is not a kind of, And here's
the whole story is they are blocking UN aid and relief and humanitarian operations because they want to control who gets the aid, where they get the aid. There's been a massive uptick, though, I've noticed on social media, a very, very strong Israeli narrative re-emerging again, that this is all about anti-Semitism. This is all about pro-Hamas. There was the posts yesterday that I was reading about saying that many Jews in Britain are fleeing Britain to move to Israel because they can't bear the environment that's been created here. I've noticed, actually, there was quite an interesting article which people might enjoy reading by Hadley Freeman, talking about how conflicted it feels to be Jewish in Britain at the moment. And it's an article which basically says on the one hand, on the other. So on the one hand, Hamas wants to kill all Jews. On the other hand, tens of thousands of people are being killed in Gaza. On the one hand, these stories are coming from the Hamas Health Authority. On the other hand, etc. But what was interesting about it as a revelation of the fact that there still isn't a completely open debate on this is that the fundamental question that isn't asked in that whole article is, why is the killing still going on? You can see a year ago that there was a story about Hamas wanting to kill Jews, Israel's right of self-defense, going after Hamas. But now, as we're moving up towards the 2-year anniversary, the question of why it's still going on, what the strategic objective is, whether any of this stuff around humanitarian aid can be justified, why is that not being asked?
We partly discussed this answer last week, that it is ultimately, there's a lot of this is bound up with Netanyahu's survival, a lot of it's bound up with the hard right and the cabinet who are open about wanting to sort of drive Gazans and drive Palestinians out of the West Bank as well.
But I was with a very senior, very, very, to take your words from them, very, very, very senior Israeli opposition figure 10 days ago. And they were saying in a speech, this is very polarized. And they said, on the one hand, you have Hamas and people talking about from the river to the sea. And I was expecting them to say, on the other hand, you have Smotrich and Ben-Gvir talking about Greater Israel and expelling all Palestinians. That second bit never came. This was an opposition figure who's absolutely not part of that coalition. Still not quite prepared to call out Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. And I thought that was very striking.
A lot of people are. There was a big march again yesterday. But this thing about, if you are remotely critical of anything that the Israelis do, you are pro-Hamas and anti-Semitic. I mean, it's so offensive. But they know that's the narrative that they're trying to shape, because they want to stop people criticizing them, stop people calling this stuff out. That's why they hate the Greta Thunberg stuff, because for a day or two it did get an awful lot of traction. We talked about it last week, and I got literally within half an hour of the podcast being out, I was getting messages from people in Netanyahu's office. One of them just said, "I'm very disappointed in you." I said, well, I'm very disappointed in you, because you're now justifying things that cannot be justified. And I keep going back to the point. They keep saying that they're, when you see these kids who are starving, you see, civilians being killed, you see, there's barely a hospital left. And they always say we were targeting a Hamas cell, a Hamas this, a Hamas that. I'm sorry, but give us the names. Who have you killed? Who have you killed to justify all of the people who are not terrorists, who are not Hamas? Or are you now saying, because I'm sure this is what some of the people in that Louis Theroux Settlers film think, they're all terrorists because they're Gazans. That's the sort of mindset that some of them have now got.
Okay.
This one for you, Rory, because you really want to talk about this.
Yeah.
Jacob Donnelly, how could a global trade war affect our access to hardware and software needed to secure organisations from cyber threats? How is policy evolving within the UK and EU to help us defend ourselves? Well, that's one for you, because all I've got to go on here is this brilliant article by Misha Gleddy in the Financial Times, which was pretty scary.
Go on, tell us a bit about that.
Well, he starts off with this thing about, that there's lots of focus on the fact that Marks and Spencer got hit and it led to empty shelves, and it's going to cost them like hundreds of millions. But he starts off the piece with one about a company called Synovis, which provides blood testing and transfusions to the NHS. And I wonder whether this is related, even though it wasn't said, but a lot of our papers the other day were leading on the story that there's a shortage of blood.
Yep.
But basically he said that 2 patients suffered serious long-term harm, and this was deemed to be a 2 on the matrix of 6 for cyber incidents. And he says we're not far off from having a 1.
Right.
I don't know. I think Marks and Spencer may be in a 2 as well. I don't know.
Well, let's get back to the whole story. So the normal story that we celebrate is a story where we all seem to like the 90s and the early 2000s as being an age of
New Labour
and
optimism,
what I want to call the
happiness,
rules-based international order.
Effective government.
Yeah. But the weird exception to this story is in the world of the internet and cyber. So whereas in much of the rest of the world, those eras, the 1990s, early 2000s, was about creating international agreements, International Criminal Court, for example, World Trade Organization, Single Market, NAFTA. There was a deliberate decision, basically, to leave the internet as a kind of Wild West. And I don't know whether you were conscious of this at the time. Were you sort of conscious of the fact that there wasn't actually much effort made to do international regulation on cybersecurity, cyber threats, cyber attacks?
I'll be honest, I don't know what we thought. I think we saw it as being bound up in the whole excitement about globalization and prosperity. I can remember, I think I may have told you before, that once when I was doing a briefing and it was about the Genome Project, about which I knew next to nothing.
Yeah.
And I was asked a question, and instead of saying, I know I should know about this, but I don't. I'm a bit thick when it comes to sort of, science and technology. I said what I thought was a completely bland, neutral, parking the question. By the time I got back to Downing Street, shares were plunging of all these sort of biotech companies because I'd said something that, and I think Bill Clinton phoned Tony Blair and said, "What the fuck's going on?" So I don't think we were, and I can remember Liz Lloyd, who's now back in government working for Keir Starmer, who was then working for us, and she was very much on the kind of environmental stuff. I remember her sometimes talking about, this tech stuff's going to be so important. We did, I've said to you before, we did get onto the old information superhighway, but I'd be lying if I said that we thought this was going to become quite the phenomenon it has. Tony Blair's catching up now, by the way. He's utterly obsessed with it.
He's talking about almost something else. Anyway, one of the reasons why the US and the UK didn't police it is that it suited us because Five Eyes, and this has become, I'm not revealing secrets here because unfortunately this has become clear through WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, basically thought it rather suited us not to regulate it because we were, from the National Security Agency, GCHQ, hacking into absolutely everything. And we thought, in a slightly smug way in those days, that the US, the UK, and others had such a massive superiority over Russia, China, or any adversary when it came to penetrating this stuff, getting into this stuff, mounting attacks, that it wasn't in our interests to regulate it or control it. Things then began to change because from two big changes, I think. One of them is more and more of the world went online. So from 2005 onwards, you begin to see suddenly, Gmail puts all your emails and data out there. Online shopping becomes absolutely enormous. So huge opportunities for criminals. And the second thing is then states beginning to do it. So Russia mounts a big attack on Estonia in 2008. And then you get the fake news stuff happening. So you get the Syrian cyber army putting out a fake tweet from the Associated Press saying the White House is on fire, which tumbles the US stock market back in 2014. And then you get this agreement between the criminal gangs and the governments, which you see particularly in Russia. Essentially, Putin lets the hackers get on with it, and a lot of them are mafia groups, provided when he rings them up and says, could you help me out here on a cyber attack? They get in behind him. There was a big attack against Ukraine, which wasn't actually as effective as it might have been if it had been mounted against the UK or the US, because a lot of Ukraine wasn't connected as much as would be the case in the UK.
Where are you getting all this from?
Well, so I've read a couple of books, read a couple of great books. Scott Shapiro, Fancy Bear Goes Fishing, with a PH.
Mm-hmm.
There's another book, which I like less, actually, but Nicole Peloth, because it's slightly sensational, called This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends. Fancy Goes Fishing is actually written by a colleague of mine at Yale Law School. Really good at explaining clearly the computer science behind the attacks. Anyway, the reason why I wanted to raise it, though, just to finish, is that your old friend Donald Trump is now featuring in this, because the Biden administration tried at the end to pass emergency legislation to make sure that the future generation of the internet had built into it from the beginning proper protection against cyber attacks and particularly quantum attacks. And Donald Trump announced 2 days ago, and again, this is probably one of the biggest things he's done that nobody's noticed, that he's dismantling all of Biden's protections in the name of deregulation, free trade, and essentially allowing a free-for-all. And so things that people were less worried about. I did a big cyber conference, one of these big events at the Excel Center 10 days ago. And what was clear there is that people were beginning to worry about how AI can mount attacks, but they were less worried about quantum computing. They thought they were ready to deal with the quantum threats. Now I'm getting messages from those same people saying, oh my goodness, what Trump's done has suddenly made all of that much, much more dangerous.
He's also gone on a bit of a similar journey on Bitcoin, hasn't he? He was always, you had a sense he was sort of a bit alarmed and worried about that. But now that it's sort of, flowing into his coffers, he's
and the two things connect, because of course cryptocurrency is the main way that cyber criminals make money. That's the great untraceable way that when they attack your company and say, give us $50 million or we're going to dismantle your entire system. That's how they collect their money.
So why are governments not more worked up about that? Why are they
the story used to be...
I get the Russian point, but why are the Americans...
The story used to be that it rather suited our agencies and the Five Eyes to be able to stick our fingers into this. The second part of the story is a lot of these companies are secretive about it. So well done, Michigan, for getting stories out. But a lot of these companies are being attacked with cyber attacks and are paying the ransom and are not revealing it because they don't want to admit paying ransom. Our banks are losing incredible amounts of money. I don't know whether you've ever been the victim of a bank fraud, but the fact that our banks are able to cover these frauds shows how much they must be ripping us off as customers if they're able to absorb these
insurance policies are, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Misha Glenny's book is called Dark Market: How Hackers Became the New Mafia. Yeah, I find this stuff a bit scary. I've got to be honest. And let's go on to the related question from Dawn Reef. I've just watched Sam Coates, Sky News, get gaslit by ChatGPT. I'm now more terrified of AI than ever. Please convince me not to be, or at the very least explain that what happens in the video shouldn't be a surprise. Did you see it? You did.
I did see it. Yeah. So
you thought he was a bit silly.
I thought it was weird, actually. Because I thought Sam should have known this. It was as though he didn't really understand what an AI system is. So the story, how did the story strike you? Because you sent me the tweet. What was it for you as a kind of non-massive AI person watching it? What was the story you took from what Sam was saying?
The story I took from it was that he discovered that if somebody asked AI to tell him what he had just recorded, even though the podcast he'd recorded had not been uploaded, that it gave him the answer.
And it made it up, didn't it?
And it made it up.
Yeah,
and then
yeah.
when he asked, he said, hold on a minute.
It invented a Sam Coates podcast,
Correct.
complete with jokes and exchanges,
Correct.
which hadn't happened. Yeah.
And then when he said, hold on a minute, I didn't actually say that. And he said, have you just made this up? No.
It said, no,
Yeah.
I didn't make it
Is
up.
that right?
It really
Did I
happened.
get
No,
that right?
that's exactly right. You're completely right. So this is actually the reason why I was a bit surprised that Sam Coates made such a big deal with it, and he dragged it out over a lot of minutes.
Listen, it's a 24 news channel, Rory. They've got a lot. They're not like us with very, very limited time as we drone on for the second hour.
No, is that AI's been doing this since the very beginning. I mean, this is the story of hallucination. Goes back to the very early ChatGPT, and actually, it changes over time as they begin to as the models retrain on their own stuff. The amount they hallucinate go up and down, which is why I would encourage you, if you're doing this. I at the moment run 4 models at one time on my phone. So I'm running ChatGPT and I'm using the O3 model, but I'm also running DeepSeek, which is the Chinese model. I'm running Grok, which is Elon Musk's model, and I'm running Claude, which is...
What do you mean by you're running them?
Oh, well, they're apps on my phone. So,
Okay.
So if you see my phone...
I'm you still write things. And
yeah, but there's Claude, there's Grok, there's DeepSeek, there's ChatGPT.
Do you use them different things for different things?
Absolutely, yeah. Grok's very good on things like clean economic analysis. ChatGPT 03 was pretty good until something's going a bit weird with it over the last week. I mean, they are very odd.
What?
Well, over the last week, it's begun to produce less and less detailed answers. And when you challenge
Fewer
it,
and fewer.
fewer and fewer detailed answers. And when you challenge it in the way, and this is, I think, what Sam was experiencing, for example, I said to it, what was the date when Henry VIII abolished the laws of the forest in Britain? And it produced...
Why did you want to know that at that time?
Because I've been writing about Cumbria and the abolition of forest laws in Cumbria.
Okay,
right?
As part of the mayoral bid, yeah.
As part of my non-mayoral bid for Cumbria, yeah. And then it's gave me 3 paragraphs on Henry VIII abolishing the laws without a date. So I said, now what's the date? And it did again the 3 paragraphs. And then I said, date! ! And it just did the 3 paragraphs again. So there's something going wrong. That wouldn't have been true 10 days ago. 10 days ago, O3 had a good logical method for checking itself, and it would have got its way to the date. So it's getting itself into a muddle.
What's the best? I've used ChatGPT very, very, very rarely.
So for simple economic analysis, Grok. For general stuff until this week, O3. For political analysis, except when you're talking about China, DeepSeek. And for literary writing, Claude.
Seriously, for DeepSeek, you would go for America, you'd go to DeepSeek.
Really good if you want.
Surely they're just as biased against America as they are for China.
It's it's not. DeepSeek isn't biased. What it does is when you ask it a question that triggers some alert put up by the Chinese Communist Party, it just shuts down and won't answer. It says, "I'm sorry, I can't help you with that answer." It doesn't produce.
Like if you said, "Is Xi
response.
Jinping corrupt?" What would happen?
It'll be saying, "I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. Please ask me another question."
Right.
But if you said to
if you said, "Is Donald Trump corrupt?"
I don't really ask it that kind of question. I mean, that's the other point.
If you did.
Okay, I'll tell you what has to do. Let's do it because it'll do it immediately. The other thing about DeepSeek is very, very quick.
Okay.
So is Donald Trump corrupt? Now thinking, the user is asking whether Donald Trump is corrupt. This is a complex question that requires careful analysis based on the search results. Right? Let me review the key evidence. Extensive allegations, footnote 2 and 10. Lavish gifts like a $400 million gift from Qatar 3, 4, 11. Executive orders boosting their value. Footnote 10. Based on comprehensive review of the provided causes, the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that Donald Trump has engaged in systematic corruption during his presidency, particularly since resuming office in January 2025. Below is a detailed analysis of the key findings. Now, the reason I'm reading it to you like that is it's quite possible before it gets to the end of its answer, this Chinese model will say something that suddenly triggers an alert and it will wipe everything. So I'm still wondering whether it's going to end the answer. Often it's halfway through its answer where it suddenly says, sorry, I can't answer that question. Please go. And I'm screenshotting its partial answers.
So to put in, is Xi Jinping corrupt?
Okay, very good. Is Xi Jinping corrupt? Server busy. Please try again later.
Excellent. So listen, talk about AI. Rankin, the photographer.
Yeah.
Very fine man. Big fan of the podcast. Anyway, I saw him yesterday about something completely different, but he gave me this book and I've got one for you as well. So this is it's called Fake. play on words,
Yeah.
fake, F-A-K-E, F-A-I-K.
Oh, AI. Oh, I see the AI.
Because the whole thing, apart from one interview with him,
Yeah.
has been done by AI.
Oh, I see. And part of his point, presumably, is that as an incredible photographer, it's really disturbing that AI is generating incredibly high quality photographs, which are not being taken by photographs.
They really are. They're amazing. And I don't think you can tell.
And part of the problem, presumably, then, is what happens to that industry. There was something sort of, I don't want to be cheeky, but one question around Sam when he was showing this. So what exactly was he doing asking ChatGPT to write a podcast for him?
That he'd recorded?
Well, it sort of
He might be trying to show something.
slightly sounded as though every week he was actually using ChatGPT to help compose this podcast. But maybe this is a bit dangerous because the answer is you can already, Gemini does this. Gemini's actually getting better and better. I'm sorry, I didn't praise them. That's the fifth model that's getting better and better. But Gemini's the Google product.
Yeah.
The people who have really been slow were Google and now Apple, which just don't know what they're doing when it comes to AI.
Well, look at this, right? So this is a whole section here about Glasgow.
Yeah, and it's called Rain as Glasgow.
Poverty in the old days, as it were. And I mean, so these are entirely fake.
Figure who looks a bit like I do when I wake up in the morning.
No, I don't. I'm pretty sure I look as bad as that.
No.
And then there's lots of politics in here as well, but it just sort of makes you wonder, well, why are photographers going to exist? Why are designers going to exist? Why are...
Yeah, well, more than that. I was talking to the head of one of the biggest telecoms company in the world. It's laid off 85% of its people in its call centers, and it's closing its stores using AI to do this from, I think, 15,000 down to 6,000. They're the first to move, but as that's the model, you're looking at major companies laying off the majority of their staff. And this is the big story, because within 5 years, we could end up with 40% of the jobs in the United Kingdom disappearing. But the main thing to take away from the Sam thing, before we move on, final question, is you've got to use these things all the time and learn their personalities. They're like bright graduate students who make mistakes, make stuff up, bluff. But you have to learn what they're likely to bluff on, what they're not likely to bluff on, and how to check them. And what you must never do is what Sam's doing, which is checking them against themselves. Yeah. If you say to them, you lied, didn't you? They either sometimes say, oh, so sorry, and then make up another lie, or they say, no, I didn't lie, right? So you really have to check it against an external source. Right, here's a question that's coming, quite good timing, coming from Jason, which is, what on earth has happened to the New European, and why has it changed its name? And are you suddenly ashamed of Europe?
No, the New European was started as an emotional spasm. Something must be done. I think what it does, it accepts that Brexit's happened.
Yeah.
We will continue as the new world to be very anti-Brexit, calling out the lies, calling out the economic disasters.
You've accepted it. It's no more rage against the dying of the light.
No, we are raging against the dying of the light, but it's a fact. Brexit has happened.
Okay.
And added to which, I think we've discovered that quite a lot of people who like the look of the New European don't pick it up on the newsstands because they think it's just about Europe. And in fact, it's about, we write a lot about China, about, we cover the world.
So what's the new name of it?
The New World.
Oh, The New World.
And this is amazing. Do you know that's never, ever been copyrighted?
The New World.
The New World has never been copyrighted.
Novaya Zemlya. No?
Yeah. Le Monde, Die Welt.
Right, okay.
All this, but so no, we're still going to be there.
Final question coming off Brave New World is, why do politicians always have people standing behind them in important speeches? Is this a recent thing? Surely it's a pretty risky strategy. Tell us about what happened to the Rachel Reeves speech. You were trying to act it out for me just before we came on.
Well, she was making a speech in what I think was a factory, and there was the backdrop was with these workers. They were all male,
right?
But the guy immediately behind her right shoulder sort of went viral because he was basically pulling his face a lot, not in a kind of rude way, but just a sort of rolling his eyes and all this. And Keir Starmer had done one a week earlier. He did the defence review up in Glasgow with the defence workers. And there was one guy there, very tall, who noticeably, when Keir took the stage, did not clap.
Right.
Okay. So I became rather obsessed with watching this non-clapping guy. And then, of course, when you saw the wider shot, the other thing is that if you were behind him, both of these speeches were delivered by auto cue, right? So the other thing that happens is the people behind can see the auto cue.
Weird.
So it sort of gets rid of the magic.
Wait, Rachel Reeves's great oratory is actually written out in an auto cue. Wow. I
Rory, when you
assumed,
say great oratory,
I assumed she was just repeating lines she'd memorized 6 months ago. I don't know if it's actually somebody's written a speech that she's reading. It's incredible.
that's harsh. That's harsh.
The,
But anyway, let me just point. So in front of
yeah,
the Keir Starmer
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
right? So you've got the people in the background, and then when you had a shot from behind the whole thing, he was basically delivering the speech to like Chris Mason, Beth Rigby.
right. There were like 3
There
people.
wasn't much of an audience there, and I think that look, the idea of having people behind you is to show you've got solidarity.
Yeah.
Northern Irish politicians always have a chunk of people.
But they're
behind
usually
them.
your party supporters, right?
Well,
They're your heavies.
You've got to be a bit careful.
Well, I remember Boris Johnson, you remember he launched his 2019 election campaign at a police academy with police officers behind him. One of them fainted.
I do remember that.
Fainted
yeah.
behind him. So generally it doesn't go well.
No, I thought that was bad as well, using a police academy as backdrop. Tony once did it. I remember once in Iraq. In fact, it was the day, the Andrew Gilligan report on the BBC. And Tony was making a speech in Basra, and the troops were all around him. So they were behind him, in front of him, to the side. And he did this sort of big speech thanking them, and you know, and it was quite a good speech. And at the end of it, there was silence. And we discovered later that they'd been told not to applaud, not as an insult, but as it not to be felt, like when Trump does a speech to the troops and they're all throwing their hats in the air and all that stuff.
You don't want to be political.
You don't get dragged into politics. So we sort of totally understood that. I think maybe a real backdrop's better sometimes than the ship workers. You should check out this guy, though. He had the Rachel Reeves guy had a really expressive face. The non-clapping guy in Govern had a very quizzical, not impressed kind of face.
I guess the anxiety is that if you don't have the people behind you, you look like a bit like you've got no mates and that you don't have any supporters.
I think if you'd have had a kind of, if it's a shipyard, get the shipyard in the background, get a ship in the background. Backdrops do matter because people look at them. They do look beyond the politicians.
As long as it's not the Titanic, which is what the Tories tend to put behind them.
Right, well, on the Titanic, I think we should call it a day.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you.